everybody, these are two multiple choice questions for paper 2 which are to do with output gaps. The first one here is illustrating this in one type of graph, an output gap, and then this will be illustrating an output gap in a different way, because there are two different ways that you can show an output gap. There are actually more than that, but these are two that we're looking at here. On this diagram, before we even look at the answers, I'll just explain to you. On the y-axis, y in the sky, we've got real GDP, so that's GDP taking away the effect of inflation, and then on the x-axis we've got time. You can see here the trend GDP growth rate. That means that you imagine that what they've done, you can't see it here, but they've plotted over time what GDP growth was, and then they've done a line of best fit. So this shows the trend of what the GDP growth was like over that period of time. They've then done this line here, which shows what actually happened to GDP growth over that period of time. And that allows you to compare what's actually happened against what the trend was, the best fit line, over time. And therefore you can see whether what's actually happening with GDP growth is above the trend in general, or if it's below the trend in general. And you can see on here the areas that we are above the line, are when we have a positive output gap, because our actual GDP is above the trend GDP growth. The times when the line is below the trend means that we have a negative output gap. So these two areas here, because the blue areas are below the trend and therefore we have a negative output gap. So this orange means positive output gap, and blue means we have a negative output gap. And you can therefore find out here which is the right answer. We want to know which point in the trade cycle diagram illustrates a negative output gap. Remember, it's negative. Be careful in the exam that you read that carefully, you don't look too quickly. So A, no, because that's on trend. It's not positive or negative. B is negative, which is what we're looking for. So that's probably the right answer, but check the other ones. C is a positive output gap. We're looking for negative, so that's wrong. And D, again, is on the trend. So it's neither a positive nor a negative output gap, so that's wrong. So the right answer is B. The next question we're going to look at is illustrating the output gap in a different way. This again is asking you now to illustrate, so you've got to draw it yourself, a negative output gap. This is only for 1 mark. Now, the output gap, if it's negative, is going to mean that you're producing at, in this case, below your productive potential. So you are producing below your productive potential. On a long run aggregate supply curve, the point at which you can no longer produce any more is where you are at your productive potential. On this diagram, you reach your productive potential then here, where your AS curve becomes perfectly inelastic. At the point that it's perfectly inelastic, this shows you your maximum potential output. And in this case, we're showing that the output gap is the difference between what you're actually producing and what you're capable of producing. And you have a negative output gap if you're producing less than you're capable of producing. So in this case, the output gap is the distance between y, and we'll call this y1, and y2. It's the distance between there. That distance, y1 to y2, is a negative output gap. That means that you're producing less than you're capable of producing, and that's what the negative output gap is on this diagram. It is this distance here.